Welcome back, everyone, to the Muslim Glory podcast. My name is Raisa Ghazi. I'm a public speaker on leadership. I do this worldwide. And today I'm going to tell you about Islam in the Philippines. I'm very excited to do this because, like I said last time, I'm actually really fond of them. I say this about everyone, but I really do like them. They're really good people. And so I've always been a little bit interested in the history of them because when I talk to Filipinos today here in the UAE, actually, they don't know a lot about their history. A lot of times they know like very specific things. Even when I meet them outside of the country, like I meet them in, for example, in Asia. I've not been to the Philippines, but then they seem to be very far away from Muslims. Like they don't understand, why I cover up or, what Islam is like at all. And I think that's why it's sometimes really interesting to dive deeper into their history because they actually have a Muslim history. The Philippines was Muslim for 500 years. And I think that, it'd be only, I guess I wouldn't say normal, but it'd be fitting for them to know about their past. Okay, so the thing is, I talked a little bit last time about the basics of the country, but also about when Islam was introduced and how the Spanish reacted when they got to the Philippines and they saw that there were Muslims there. And nowadays, obviously, people don't like to talk about Christianity having been spread very forcefully, but that is actually it is a reality. That was a reality of the past. So I am going to talk about that. Okay. So, not only the Spanish have been in the Philippines, it's also been the Americans and the Japanese. And I wouldn't say necessarily that they are better occupiers or kinder occupiers. They've obviously been brutal as well. I think the Japanese specifically are known to be pretty tough as an occupier. However, the reason why I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the Spanish occupation is because it is very similar to other occupations that we talked about of the Spanish, the British, the Portuguese, namely when they were in Europe, for example, trying to kick out the Muslims in Spain, but also when they went to North America, Canada, and South America, and they basically tried to eradicate the identity of the natives there or, take them out if they wouldn't want to listen. And I would say that a similar thing happened in the Philippines. And that's why I think it's so interesting. I think it's so important for people to know because even though we talk about, what happened in America doesn't get enough attention. What happened in America to the Native Americans, it doesn't get enough attention. But what happened in the Philippines actually gets even less attention, Like, I almost can believe that, that there's even less attention for that. But I do want to point out how, the Spanish were very successful in intimidating people into not looking into the history of the Philippines before they came or talking about it. And actually, that's not very new either. I mean, I once talked about, this account of Robert Crane, who was an ambassador of the US and an advisor to President Nixon. And he talked about how Native Americans were forced to hide their Islamic beliefs. They were not allowed to practice anymore until the 1970s. So until about 50 years ago. And actually, in the Philippines, let me just check to be sure. In the Philippines, I would say in the Philippines, about 150 years ago, this was also still a reality. People were not allowed to write or talk about what happened before the Spanish came, who they were, what they were doing, what the Spanish did, because they would get punished by the Spanish. And so it's no surprise that the history of the Philippines is erased. It has been erased. It has been distorted and it has been suppressed. And that's why I think it's very important for all of us to talk about the history of the Philippines, to become more aware of it, to share the stories with others, and to even share it with our children one day, inshallah. That's what I think we need to do. Okay. So what is it that the Spanish specifically did in the Philippines to make sure that their identity was being erased. And I'm going to name things that you heard me talk about before in the case of, for example, Spain, Europe, or the natives in the Americas. Canada, South America, North America, they've done it everywhere. Basically, they would put them into forced resettlements, which is similar to, I would say, like a reservation for the natives in the Americas. They would put them in places outside of the place that they were used to, and then have like a city built around a church or a village built around a church, and kind of like entrench them into a Christian life, even though they didn't ask for that, even though they might not have wanted it. And so that was one way to monitor, control, but also convert the Muslim and shaman Filipinos, by the Spaniards during the time of occupation. Another thing they would do is you'd have these forced conversion camps. These forced conversion camps, I mean, should I even call them camps? They were not abroad like they were with the Muslims in Spain. Okay. So what happened in Spain is that the Muslims in Spain were often the Muslims in South America were often sent to Spain to do forced conversion camps. Even enslaved people from Africa were sent to Spain before they could go to South Africa because they had to go to forced conversion camps. Now, with the, with the Filipinos, they did have these conversion camps, but they were not abroad. And so that was a difference I did notice. Like in South America, these were abroad. They made sure that people couldn't go to South America before they actually had been in a forced conversion camp. And my, analysis is that most likely the Muslims who were in the Americas were first sent to forced conversion camps abroad as well before they could come back to the Americas. Okay, so first of all, we had the forced conversion through the way that the people were put into these, artificial villages that had a Christian setup. Then we had also these missionaries who were spreading the belief of the Christians. One thing that I think is really good to know, and I've talked about this before, is that the Filipino Muslims and shamans actually received limited access and monitored access to the Bible because the Spanish didn't want them to have full access to it. And that was because they didn't want them to see certain parts of the Bible that inspire freedom or empowerment. And so they took out these parts or they controlled these parts. And it's really funny because these Bibles are still available in the Library of Congress in the US. They have these like Spanish Bibles, but also the Bibles in the Filipino language, where, they gave those to the Filipinos, but they made sure that the Filipinos didn't have access to the full Bible. And that was because they wanted these former Muslims, maybe they were still Muslims or shamans, not to know about the true message of Christianity. And it just shows, right? When people say that the Bible has been altered, like these are instances where the Bible has been altered. We've seen that the Bible had been altered by the Dutch, who introduced slave Bibles in Suriname, South America. And again, we see here that the Spanish did the same thing. They had a specific name, these type of Bibles. It was called like Doctrina or something. And these Bibles, when you want to watch them or read them, you can actually read them in the Library of Congress. When you want to read them, you would have to know the name. What is it called again? Because I think it's good to know the name in general of these kind of like altered Bibles that they used for these people. Actually, why can't I find it? What was it called? Doctrina something. Library of Congress, you can find them in the Asian Reading Room. And so the Philippine Bible Society, they talked about how, these Bibles, ordinary Filipinos were not allowed to own them. That's what the Catholic Church did not want. Only priests had access to them. And they did that because there were certain parts of the Bible that they didn't want them to see. The parts of the Bible that they did want them to see, for example, was, Romans 13:1, let every soul be subject into the higher powers. Ephesians 6:5, slaves, obey your earthly masters. So these were the verses that the Spanish did want the Filipinos, who were at the time Muslim and shaman, that they had access to. So they would feel like, okay, I have to obey my master, aka supposedly the Spanish. But to me, that would look like, I don't think earthly masters was a thing. I don't know if that really existed. But these slave Bibles, it does remind me of, what they were doing in South America as well. I cannot find the name of it. I'm so sorry, because actually I thought it was very interesting to know this. The Bible, what is the Bible called? Where is the source? I do have the source of, I think, the Library of Congress, because I found there that you can still read it, which I thought was so interesting. Should I just click it? Yep. Let me just click it. Catholicism. And then there is this, oh, look at this. Oh, here it is. It's called Doctrina Cristiano. Okay. Maybe the reason why I didn't write it down, because I don't understand actually. It's in Spanish, but in English, it was Christian Doctrine in Spanish and Tagalog, corrected by the religious of the orders, printed with permission of. Okay, anyways. So that's a whole thing. Interesting though. Very interesting. And so I don't know if you can see it, but like this is what it looked like. They would put like pictures on it, and it's interesting. If you live in the US, you can actually check it out. Okay. So anyway, just to go back to it. Okay. So we had the Filipinos, they were being they're being forced to convert. First of all, they had to live in these Christian towns. A lot of times they had to, go attend church. They had to read this Bible, but not by themselves. They had to do it while being monitored by the priest, because they didn't want them to have access to the full Bible. But then also one thing that I think is really important to know is that they took the children of the Filipino Muslims and the shamans and put them in these residential schools. And this is something that, if you know anything about the occupation of indigenous people, they did it in Australia. They did it with the natives in North America. They did it with the natives in Canada. I mean, even recently, they're still finding all these boarding schools with like mass burials where they were actually taking out these kids. They did it in Greenland with the Inuit. They used education to erase the identity of indigenous people. And I think this is really important for everybody to know, because it doesn't matter where your kid goes to school. I think you really need to be aware that education is a lot of times by these occupiers used as a tool to erase people's identities. And that's what they did in the Philippines. And that's what they still do. I mean, there's so many of these agendas being rolled out in education. Why? Because they want to have access to the minds of the children so that they grow up being subjective or submissive towards, the elite of that time. And so at that time, those were the Christians, and they were the ones who were, taking away children from their parents, giving them different names, not allowing them to speak their own language. I mean, right now, the Filipinos are still speaking English, the third largest English-speaking country in the world. I mean, in contrary, right, to the Indonesians who were occupied by the Dutch, but they resisted and they did not start speaking their language. And mashallah, I'm really happy that they did that. But when it comes to the Caribbean, for example, the country where my parents are from, Suriname, the official language there is Dutch, because the Dutch did come there, strip the people of their identity, and then also, enforce their language upon them. Okay, so that's something that's really important to know. Limited access to the Bible, being forced into these communities that were Christian, being taken away from your parents as a Filipino Muslim or a shaman child, and then having to go to a Christian boarding school. And this is interesting because the reason why the Filipinos actually found out that it wasn't normal that they didn't have access to the Bible is because when Protestantism came to the Philippines, they actually really promoted the idea of self-study, that you study study by yourself, read the Bible. And so these Muslims in the Philippines who are being forcefully converted understood that this wasn't even done in a way that was very ethical. You know, if you're a Christian, you would want people to just have access to your books, right? You would want Christians to read their books. And so that's how they found out that they were actually being indoctrinated. They were being indoctrinated with a specific form of Christianity that left out many emancipating and empowering passages. Okay. Oh yeah, it was called Doctrina Cristiano in 1593. This was not the full Bible. Doctrina Christianity was a Bible that was edited and given to the Filipinos who were Muslim and shaman just to make sure they didn't have access to the entire script. That's crazy. Okay. And so then, here also what they did, the Spanish, what they also did is they tried to create this image where they would say that the Muslim traditions and rituals were uncivilized. And they would say to the Filipinos, you know, your grandparents were uncivilized. And they would say it also to the, you know, they would say pagans, but, you know, they called the Muslims also pagans, but also the indigenous traditions, which were more shamanic, they called those pagan as well. And yeah, I mean, to me, I can see the pattern everywhere, right? All of these colonizers used the same patterns. So Filipinos were indoctrinated rather than converted to Christianity. So the Muslim Filipinos were indoctrinated rather than converted to Christianity because they didn't have access to the full Bible. They didn't have free will in this sense, because if they did not want to convert to Christianity, they would lose out on economic opportunities because you couldn't get a good job if you weren't a Christian. You couldn't get the right education because education was being sponsored by these Christian schools and missionaries, and they were basically becoming social pariahs to the point where, you know, if you don't have food, if you don't have any way to live, you have no livelihood, obviously a lot of people are then going to convert to your religion. And I think if you're then also put in a situation where you're not allowed to speak about these experiences, you're not allowed to speak about who you used to be and what your occupier is doing to you right now, then you actually become a nation where nobody remembers who you are. And that's what happened to the Filipino Muslims. I think a lot of them don't know about their history because it wasn't allowed for them to speak about who they used to be and how they were being treated poorly by the Spanish. Okay. And so, you know, these types of similarities, I've mentioned them constantly. One thing, however, that's really interesting also about the Filipino Muslims is that a lot of them were also sent to the US, I think South America a lot, but even North America, where I think Mexico is actually the place where they were sent. So a lot of the Filipino Muslims and the indigenous people were sent to Mexico as a sort of punishment if they weren't willing to, you know, peacefully convert. And then they were put in also like these type of pueblos, and also basically their names would be taken away, their language would be taken away, and they were expected to just like go live there. And, you know, if you don't want to comply, then there's another thing waiting for you there. So yeah, I mean, this I think is very interesting. I think there's many of these figures in the history of the Filipinos who were actually resistant fighters. One of them was Jose Rizal. And Jose Rizal, I mean, he has a Muslim last name. It was said that he was a Christian, but he did dig into the life of Filipinos before the Spaniards came. So I do wonder to what extent he was also aware of how his identity of his ancestors had been stripped and how they had been forced to convert. I think he was very well aware of it. And I mean, in the end, you know, this man had a very problematic life because he ended up being executed as well by the Spanish. But you just have to know that simply talking about what life was like before the Spanish came made you eligible for trial. And that's what happened to Jose Rizal as well. I think one thing that you need to know about how they were very calculated in how they were trying to make sure that the history was being erased is by, they were also trying to, get goodwill from the elite of the Philippines. And a lot of these elite families, they had opportunities to study in Spain. And so you have to understand, for an elite family, a Muslim elite family, for example, for them to be able to continue being an elite in the country, have high and prominent jobs, you would have to convert to Christianity. One of these people who was actually an elite in the Philippines, who had a very high ranking position, was Paterno. And what they did with Paterno is they sent him abroad to study in Christian schools, Christian universities. And then if he pledged alliance to the Christians, he was able to get very high-ranking jobs. And so he did get very high-ranking jobs. I think even at some point a minister, he was one of the first Filipino ministers. But that does mean that if they find out that you're speaking about the history of the Spanish or Philippines pre-Spanish, that you are at risk. He was ranked high enough that he wasn't at risk, but he did, at some point get into that. And that was very dangerous for him. Okay, so these are some of the I think similarities. So we had the Muslim Filipinos being forced to live in Christian communities, taking away their names, their language. They were given Doctrina Christianas, which was an edited Bible. They didn't have access to the full Bible. The kids were taken away, sent to these boarding schools like they did with all these indigenous people all over the world. They took away their children. It happened in Greenland. There's still cases going on. It happened in Canada. They're taking away the children to make sure they strip them from that identity. And that's how they basically made sure that the Philippines became a Christian country. And the conclusion, basically education was used as a tool, and it always has been used as a tool. It is still till today used as a tool. If you look at, for example, in Europe, where, women with the hijab are not allowed to enter certain educational institutes if they wear a hijab, it shows how education is still used to deny Muslims actually opportunities in life. And, the thing is, at the time where all of this was happening, the Spanish weren't a democracy yet. Okay. So the Spanish became a democracy, I think not even a few decades ago. And so the thing is, like, when they talk openly about, for example, forcing people to become Christian, when they talk about, what is another thing they did? People are not allowed to talk about the history of their country. Those were all normal because they weren't democracies, right? Now they have similar things they do. They still suppress a lot of people, even though they are democracies, but they do it more sneaky. And so that's the thing. That's why I do believe that democracies are actually, the term democracy is sometimes used as a tool of repression in, Middle Eastern countries, where they'll be like, oh, you cannot do that because of democracy. You cannot do that because of democracy. But meantime, they're doing those things, but they're doing it in a very covered up way. One thing I noticed with Muslims, however, is that they're becoming so used to the idea that a democracy is a superior form of governance that they will literally go around and say to people from, Muslim countries that are not democracies, oh, but you don't even live in a country with these democratic values. No, you cannot even do this in your country. But I'm like, that democracy is the reason why it's so hard for Muslims in the West to thrive, because everything now has become very hush-hush, where they used to openly say, Filipinos were not allowed to talk about their history. Nowadays, they don't say Muslims are not allowed to talk about their history. They just alter your algorithm. They just make sure you don't get the exposure. And so the idea of a democracy is maybe amazing if it actually is being applied, but it's not being applied though. But because it is being glorified, a lot of the undemocratic practices are now happening in a very sneaky way. So that's just something I really want to share with you. Okay, so that's what's been happening in the Philippines. What's happening today? Well, what I think is really interesting, and I mean, it's not a surprise at all, but Islam is today the fastest growing religion in the Philippines. It is a religion that, very famous people are converting to Islam. Celebrities in the Filipino, society are Muslim nowadays. And I think that's really good. And I hope that also a lot of Filipinos, they become more aware of their background so that they can also, reflect on that and wonder, why did the Spaniards come and fight so harshly against Muslims? And why until today, Muslims are still being oppressed in the society? I hope it also sparks a certain curiosity. And, once you're ready, come to the faith. That's all I can say. But some of the famous Filipinos are, for example, Ruben Padilla. He was like a bad boy in cinema. And he basically converted to Islam. Then you have his daughter, Kylie Padilla. And she's also made a name for herself in television and film, openly following Islam, apparently. You have a singer and actress, her name is Yasmin Kurdi, but she was already of Lebanese descent, practices Islam. Then you have Freddie Aguilar, which is a folk musician, and he also converted to Islam. He's now known as Abdul Farid. And then you have Yasmin Umali, which I think is a really interesting case because she used to be Miss Universe Philippines 2021, and she also embraced Islam after. I'm like, yeah, you go, girl. So, many famous Filipinos are now representing Islam in the Philippines, where it was punishable by death to be a Muslim, and that's what I love about, obviously about Islam. Like you cannot fight it. Even when you're being threatened with your livelihood, even when you're being threatened with your life, Islam remains. The stories have remained. The people, I am pretty sure there are people there who, were forced to convert, who were very aware of the fact that they faced a lot of risk by being Muslim, who were aware that they weren't allowed to talk about their past and being a Muslim, but who managed to keep it. I'm pretty sure because we had that, right? I mean, that's what happened in the US as well. There were Cherokees who remained Muslim. They maintained Islam. They pretended they were not when they pretended they were not when the US government would come check up on them, and they would pretend to be like some weird ass religion, just make something up on the spot. And, I don't know the stories of Filipinos who maintained Islam, but I am very curious. And whenever I do a podcast, I always get like so many nice reactions from people who actually live that life or know someone who lives that life. And like, I'm so curious. Like, I cannot even express how curious I am because firstly, I really like Filipino people, but also just like to be in touch with these people and like ask them more questions because like with the natives, like I've actually done interviews, with Native Americans after I learned everything I learned. And then I asked them loads of questions about their beliefs and, their similarities to Islam. And it was super interesting. Okay. Anyways, I'm so on time today. Okay. Anyways, this was the end of my podcast. I'm really happy I had a chance to talk about this. Please reach out with more information or comments if you have any. And make sure to watch again next week. Subscribe to my channel. If you want to become a public speaker, you sign up for the Speak Out course. I cannot wait to stop. Like my hijab is super tight and I just need to have like a coffee and relax. I have my book with me. I'm going to be researching my next topic and inshallah, I'll be able to surprise you once again with beautiful Muslim history in the world and with stories that we don't hear enough so that you can keep spreading the word. Make sure your children know, make sure your neighbor knows, okay? Make sure everybody knows. Help me out a little bit, okay? Just talk about it, mention it everywhere. Keep the history alive. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. See you next week.